Welcome, and thank you for joining today's conference, Western EIM Governance Review Committee meeting. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the chat panel by using the associated icon located at the bottom of your screen. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. All audio lines have been muted until the Q&A portion of the call. We will give you instructions on how to ask a question at that time. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. With that, I'll turn the call over to Greg Fisher, sitting in for Roger Clinton. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start with the roll call for the committee members. Start with Tony Braun.
Here.
Suzanne Cooper.
Here.
Eric Eisenman.
Here.
Jennifer Gardner.
Here.
Therese Hampton.
Here.
Doug Howe.
Here.
Christine Raper.
Here.
Rob Taylor.
Here.
Rebecca Wagner.
Here.
Mary Winke.
Here.
Angelina Galitova.
Here.
And Valerie Fawn.
Here.
Okay, and just to note, both Andrew Campbell and Cameron Yurkowski are not able to make this meeting. I'll turn it back over to Chair Hampton for the first item.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and thanks to everybody who have joined to listen into this webinar. We're really excited to share with you kind of an overview of the governance straw proposal. We're going to start first asking if there is any public comment that people would like to give on items that are not on the agenda. We will provide for public comment on every item that's on the agenda this afternoon, but is there any public comment before we start? Not, operator, do you see anybody raising their hand or expressing interest in public comment?
As a reminder, if you do have a comment, please hit #2 on your telephone keypad. And I currently have no callers in queue.
Great, thank you. We'll turn it back to Greg Fisher for general session.
Thank you. All right, so the next item then is the decision on the general session meeting minutes for May 5th, 2020. And for approval, may I get a motion, please?
This is Rob Taylor. I'll make a motion.
Okay, and a second?
This is Eric Eisenman. I second.
Okay, I'm going to take roll call for the vote. Tony Braun?
Yes.
Suzanne Cooper?
Yes.
Eric Eisenman?
Yes.
Jennifer Gardner?
Yes.
Therese Hampton?
Yes.
Doug Howe?
Yes.
Christine Raper?
Yes.
Rob Taylor?
Yes.
Rebecca Wagner?
Yes.
And Mary Winke?
Yes.
Okay, the motion passes. On to the next item on the agenda. Back to you, Chair Hampton.
Terrific. Thank you. What I want to do to start is just give you a little bit of context for where we've been in this process and what we're going to be presenting here today. Before I do that, I have to first thank every one of the Governance Review Committee members. This has been a terrific process and really a team where everybody has contributed in many different ways. And so I'm excited that you get to hear from many of the different members today as we walk through the proposal. I'd also like to thank the CAISO staff, Peter Calusi in particular, and all of the other folks within CAISO that have contributed to helping us put this product together. So thank you very much for that. What it took for us to get to this point today. So just a reminder, we issued a scoping document back in the end of January where we asked for stakeholder feedback on a number of different issues. We had 6 issue categories. This straw proposal is actually structured consistent with that in these 6 issue categories. We got feedback from all of you, held a workshop in early March, and heard from different stakeholders where they kind of elaborated on their perspectives. And we used that information, both the written comments and that workshop, to really take kind of a deeper dive, and we broke into subgroups and really worked through the comments and built a set of options and looked at different approaches for how to approach this governance issue. And we worked in subgroups, and then we came back together as a full governance review committee and built this recommendation that is the straw proposal that was posted last Friday and that we'll talk about here today. So that's really the process that we've been through. What I'd like to do is just give you a little bit of, I think if we can move the slide. I'm sorry, I forgot I needed to tell you to do that. I'm moving my slide. So go to the next slide as well. Like I mentioned, we've got these 6 major categories, and then we built all of this based on the feedback that we received from you and that we heard at the workshop. And so one of the purposes for the straw proposal is really to solicit your input on this. So this, again, is the beginning of another round of hearing from you, both in written comments, and we'll talk about this at the end, but we have a meeting scheduled on September 15th, where, again, we'd like to hear from stakeholders to further kind of describe and elaborate on their comments on this. One of the things that the group, if we go to the next slide, one of the things that the Governance Review Committee developed in this process was an overarching goal and a set of general principles that we would use to develop the proposal and the recommendation. And so what's on the screen now is this larger overarching goal, which was that we really want to develop a clear and common understanding in evaluating stakeholder responses and developing work products and straw proposals, and use those factors to consider in looking at the different various alternatives. And so if we go to the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. What I thought was coming was a slide that actually talked about the overarching goal. So the overarching goal that we have for this is that we have a set of factors to assess the different alternatives to assure that it aligns with the GRC principles that we've set forth, that the different alternatives, what kind of level of resources and alternatives they may require, or any complexity it may introduce, and then the level of stakeholder support that might be required to support a proposal. And ultimately, we want to have a proposal that ensures that any modification to the governance of the EIM provides stakeholders throughout the West with the confidence that governance structure represents the market as a whole and broadly respects and considers the interests of all stakeholders and is resilient under a wide range of market conditions. So this is the overarching goal that we looked at, kind of wanting to consider not only the different perspectives in the market, but also kind of the level of support that we might find among the stakeholders. So with those kind of overarching goal and the principles, then we transition into these recommendations. And what I'll do now is go to each of the GRC kind of members that participated in this and let them present to you the different concepts. So we'll start with issue 1, which is delegation of authority for market rules, and I'll turn that over to Tony Braun and Eric Eisenman. Tony Braun will start that. And we will take comments at the end of each section or questions at the end of each section. We're not going to be using the chat feature today. We're going to just take questions over the phone. And so when we get to a point where we're ready to take questions, we will open that up for that, and you'll be able to hear from the operator about how to do that. So Tony, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Therese. I'm sitting here afraid I'm going to hit the wrong button or otherwise do something technologically damaging to the presentation here today, but hopefully I'll get it right. So Eric and I are going to talk about the elements of the straw proposal and related to how the delegation and decisional authority is exercised and the changes that we're proposing. By way of a little context, I think when the committee looked at this question, which is obviously a fairly central and key question, we took into account several factors. First, when the transitional committee did its work, I think I can state with some confidence that the transitional committee, didn't really fully appreciate the amount of growth and the rapidity of the growth of the EIM that was going to occur. And so now with the contemplated expansion as early as next spring when multiple entities are proposed to be joining. We will soon be well over a majority of the load, and with the totality of the expansion plan is a very significant majority of the load in the Western Interconnection. Obviously, we're looking at the potential of an extended day-ahead market, so we need the governance structure to accommodate that appropriately if indeed that moves forward. We have a lot of comments from stakeholders on these topics, and we tried to reflect those as best as possible. And then even from the beginning of the exercise of the EIM governing body authority, there's been a recognition that a lot of these elements of the market are intertwined, and so the separation of the primary authority and the primary driver test, they always run into some challenges because the market is intertwined. Certainly the real-time market rules are intertwined with each other, and the real-time market rules obviously affect the totality of the market as well. So those are the kind of things that we were taking into account when considering these changes. So may we go to the next slide? So the straw proposal contains a recommendation to go to a joint authority model. And what this will require is that both the board and the governing body act affirmatively to approve an item that's within the scope of that we delineate in the recommendation. Each body, therefore, would vote. I think look, please, to the straw proposal for mechanics of this rather than maybe the words that are on the slides here. The idea here is that we would likely have joint meetings when feasible, that discussions would be held jointly, that hopefully there would be a robust dialogue between the board and the governing body, but at the end of the day that each body would have to vote and a majority of each body would be required to move an item forward. Next slide, please. The scope that which we alluded to earlier depends on whether EDAM moves forward. So in an EIM only scenario, there would be joint authority over all real-time market rules, not the attempt to delineate the primary authority of the governing body like we have today. With an EDAM scenario, there would be joint authority over all the real-time and day-ahead market rules. And we do propose to apply this in an EIM only scenario before EDAM goes live. Next slide. Obviously, this can lead to potential deadlock, and so we've crafted an iterative process where hopefully we can resolve the issue before there's an absolute deadlock, with both bodies collaborating with each other and using staff and further work with stakeholders to resolve any potential disputes. But at the end of the day, we're recommending a dual filing model like is used in other markets. Eric, I think it's my turn to transfer it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Let me provide a tad more detail on this particular slide, slide 8. So currently, there isn't a defined process to address a situation where the Board of Governors and the EIM governing body do not agree on a proposal on say, a particular market rule. Fortunately, we haven't had a situation come up where there was a disagreement, but we felt it important to consider that this could happen. Hopefully it never will, but it certainly could. So in the scoping paper, we have outlined a process to deal with scenarios where the two bodies are not in agreement. And as Tony highlighted, it's kind of an iterative process. So what we envision is that at a public meeting where the two bodies, the Board of Governors and the EIM governing body, have agreed to disagree at that particular moment, that the members of the two bodies would identify and discuss the gaps in their positions and consider potential ways to address the areas of disagreement. And of course, this would be in a public meeting, so stakeholders would be encouraged to articulate their views. So assuming that there's still this disagreement, the Board of Governors and the EIM governing body would send the issue back to the CAISO staff for further work with stakeholders. So in essence, just like any stakeholder process, the ISO staff would have a stakeholder process to deal with these identified issues and gaps. And then at some point they would have an amended proposal and then back to the two bodies for a vote. If the two bodies at that point then do approve, it would just go to FERC as any other initiative. If they still disagree, they could send it back to the staff one more time. So you'll see on the slide it's two remands to staff to resolve. And the staff would just reiterate that again, go through the stakeholder process. And if all fails there's still disagreement, then the staff would actually file two separate proposals at FERC, and then it would go through the FERC process, and FERC would decide that. Just one little nuance here, it's actually possible that there would only be, one body would want a proposal sent to FERC, and the other body would want no change. So it actually could only be one proposal, but that would be opposed by one or the other of the bodies, either the board or the governing body. Next slide, please. So let's talk about durability here and keeping this delegation authority that Tony has outlined and not having to change all the time. So first of all, for context, under California law, the CAISO board has ultimate authority. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to really speak to that, but there is an appendix in the straw proposal that does outline that. What we as a committee were talking about was enhancing the durability of delegation, and in essence to make it more complicated, more difficult to change the provisions of the delegation of authority that the board has made to the governing body. So, we do want to go forward with the proposal. It has a few steps. So, the type of delegation the governing body has now is mostly primary authority or advisory, and that's in the ISO's bylaws. And to change that, at least 2/3 of the board or a majority of both bodies would have to approve that. So what we're proposing now was the first step to change anything is that there would have to be a unanimous vote of the board to make this kind of change with the delegated authority that we're proposing to the governing body. And this, of course, would have input from stakeholders, probably from the BASA, maybe there'd be a regional issues forum, and so on. And then as the last bullet and the sub-bullets say, if indeed there was a change, it wouldn't happen overnight, but there would be a period of time before it would happen, because say if an EIM entity was not pleased with this, they decided to withdraw, they have 180 days to withdraw. In that example, then the delegation of authority change would not be in effect for 180 days. So I think that's what Tony and I have. I think, Therese, this is where we were going to see if there were any comments or questions from the stakeholders at this point.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Eric. Yes, so this is a high-level overview of the main elements in the straw proposal. There's kind of more depth if you go into the straw proposal on some of these, but this is an opportunity. What we want to do today is take your clarifying questions, some of your initial thoughts. So, operator, if you could see if there are folks out there that have questions on this aspect of the straw proposal or thoughts or comments they'd like to provide for us at this time.
Once again, if you do have questions and or comments, please hit #2 on your telephone keypad, also known as #2. And I currently have no callers in queue.
Okay, we'll wait a little bit more. See if anybody has any questions or clarification.
Once again, it is #2.
We didn't get any questions from you last time, but we're kind of hoping to get questions or thoughts from folks if they have them.
We do have one question in queue.
Great, thanks.
Caller, your line is now unmuted.
Hi, this is Lauren Tenney-Dennison from the Public Power Council. First, I just want to thank the Governance Review Committee for all the work that went into this proposal. If you're looking for some initial reactions, I just think I'd like to say that for PPC, we really think that this is a promising approach on increasing the durability and really appreciate its inclusion in the proposal.
Thanks, Lauren.
We have
anyone else out there?
No more callers in queue.
Okay, let's transition to the next section, Issue 2, Selection of Governing Body Members, and Rob Taylor will do an overview of that element.
Good afternoon, everybody. If we could move to the next slide, and then why don't we just go ahead and go one more over to the, okay. I've only got one slide for you this afternoon. I want to start by thanking everyone who provided comments on this section. As you can see, the GRC really has 3 recommendations here. I just wanted to take a moment to walk through and provide you with some background on the recommendations. So the first is to provide the public interest and consumer groups a vote on the nominating committee. The nominating committee currently has 8 members, 5 of which have a vote. The remaining 3, the governing body, the board, and the public interest sector, serve an advisory role. The GRC saw the role of the public interest sector in the selection process is different from the governing body and the board. So the governing body has final say on the recommendation, so we didn't really see a need for providing a voting role here, and I think that was the original discussion when this was put together. The independence of the EIM governing body from the board is why a voting role for the board wouldn't be appropriate here either. So as we looked at the public interest role, we didn't see those 2 restrictions for them, obviously. But we also did see them as being an active in the market in terms of providing comments to the stakeholder process and through the RIF, just like the other parties did. Finally, several parties advocated for this change and no one objected, so that's why we've included it as a recommendation in the straw proposal. Second, the 60-day holdover provision. While the nominating committee has been able to timely replace governing body members, the GRC believes that the time frame is tight and there should be an option to hold a member over if necessary. So the extension would only occur in this instance. It's important to note that the committee requested that the holdover take place if the holdover was approved by the governing body and agreed to by the members. So it's a very limited circumstance that this could occur. And finally, this recommendation would allow the body to continue to function with a full board if the nominating committee couldn't act in time for any reason whatsoever. And then the final recommendation is just an enhancement to the section on selection of members and diverse qualities. So what we propose here is to enhance the language by expanding it to include gender, ethnicity, and perspectives. So those are the 3 recommendations from the Governance Review Committee as it relates to the nominating committee, and we're happy to answer any questions or take any comments at this point in time.
Once again, if you do have a question and or comment, please hit #2 on your telephone keypad. We do have one caller in queue. Caller, your line is now unmuted.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. I represent the Six Cities group in CAISO proceedings. I have no problem with any of the proposals. I think you guys in general have done a terrific job. I have one question, and the question has to do with the diversity of perspectives, and I wondered if anyone could perhaps provide a little more elaboration on what you mean by that. Perspectives in terms of what, and I think maybe that was kind of the one area of the overall recommendation that I thought perhaps needed some more fleshing out.
Sure, I'll start and ask others to join in. And I think what we were looking for here was different perspectives on the approaches to how the market could work. Don't think there's much discussion really beyond that. So approaches to market operations, different approaches as to structure, those types of perspectives. I'd encourage others to join in here if there are some other thoughts from the other members of the Governance Review Committee. So that's, I think, what the thought process. Go ahead.
If it's okay. Val, and
no, go ahead. I'm interested to hear your thoughts, and I was going to maybe offer up a for example, but you go first.
We'll take the for example. That would be really helpful. But generally, when we talk about perspectives, I think we're referring to even like different backgrounds in terms of the industry experience and whatnot, and that brings with it a different perspective on how you might look at those exact issues that Rob mentioned, whether it's how the market operates, what the rules are, you know, who gets what authorities kind of thing. Those are all, you don't want groupthink, so you really do want people with different perspectives so that there can be a good debate on the proposals that are put before the EIM governing body.
And that makes good sense to me. I guess the question is, wouldn't the difference in perspectives be something that would be either a function of or be indicated by diversity of industry experience and backgrounds? In other words, I'm wondering, is it really is it a meaningful additional element? And maybe even if it's not, it doesn't hurt to throw it in, but I guess if I were the search firm, I'd be saying, what does that mean? How is it manifested?
So this is Val again. If I could just note that, you know, perspective could come from the fact that someone's from the, you know, consumer-owned electric part of the industry. It could come from the fact that it's an IOU. It could come from the fact that somebody's been a regulator, right? So perspective, I mean, I think we intended it to have a very broad meaning, but if there's suggestions you could make that would help elucidate that, that would be, you know, greatly appreciated.
Okay, that's fair enough, and I'll think about it and see if I can give suggestions for how better to define it or give it sort of more substance.
Any other questions or comments?
There are no more questions in queue.
Okay. Well, thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate that. So we're going to transition to one of the other kind of big sections in the straw proposal, which is engagement with stakeholders. And Jennifer Gardner is going to start start us with a walkthrough of that proposal.
Great. Thank you, Therese, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start off with just a little bit of background and context, which I think the other governing body members have been doing for each of their sections as well. And then I'm also going to have Commissioner Christine Raper offer some comments once we get to a section where we discuss the role of consumer-owned utilities and federal PMAs in regards to the body of state regulators. So first I want to start off by noting what comments we received from stakeholders. We received a lot of great comments in this section. There's clearly a lot of interest here in the current stakeholder process and whether there are ways to enhance it and make it more effective. So essentially, commenters were split on whether a new stakeholder advisory committee or a member advisory committee should be created. These were typically called a SAC or a MAC, and these would replace the currently existing Regional Issues Forum, and they would supplement the current CAISO stakeholder process that we're all very familiar with today. So they basically be a way of formalizing the Regional Issues Forum, but we'd be creating separate bodies where certain members would be selected to represent their sectors on that body, and they would provide more formal input and comments on behalf of the sectors to the governing body. So a lot of folks were interested in that. And there was a lot of commenters that actually expressed support for establishing or at least considering some type of additional formal representation for public power. And in this case, when we talk about public power, we're talking about really two different types, consumer-owned utilities and federal PMAs, such as Bonneville Power Administration. The ideas kind of ran the gamut. One idea was that we could create a separate committee entirely to represent these interests, similar to the body of state regulators. We could provide additional representation on the body of state regulators for these public power interests, or we could address their stakeholder interest as a part of setting up an entirely new stakeholder advisory committee or member advisory committee. So in terms of how things work today, I think it's worth clarifying how the RIF or the Regional Issues Forum works today before we get into the GRC's recommendation. So in the Charter for EIM Governance, it recognizes that the RIF can on occasion develop specific recommendations for can consider and discuss certain issues that are being considered as a part of the CAISO stakeholder process. But that they're not really, the RIF is not really designed to offer formal recommendations or comments to the EIM governing body or to CAISO management. Really, the RIF has been more loosely organized as a venue for stakeholders to share thoughts, to learn more about the market, and obviously to share viewpoints. But it really hasn't been a more formal body that offers comments to either of the boards. So that's a big difference. And then also, in terms of the representation of public power is essentially treated as any stakeholder is in the stakeholder process today. They obviously have representation on the nominating committee as well as in the Regional Issues Forum, but we don't have any sort of separate, more formal setup for that group of stakeholders to provide input to the governing body. So let's go ahead and go to the first slide that I have. There we go. So in terms of the recommendations from the GRC on these issues, first we wanted to address the comments that we heard on this desire to formalize the RIF and to really give it a little bit more authority in terms of being able to offer formal recommendations to the governing body. And so we really thought that starting from scratch and creating a member advisory committee or a stakeholder advisory committee at this time really didn't seem necessary. We've already got a stakeholder structure through the RIF that's working well, so why not just stick with that, but maybe give the RIF a little bit more authority to submit comments. So the recommendations are here on the slide, but essentially what we want to do with the RIF is remove limitations on discussing issues that are part of an active stakeholder process. So a great example of that would be in today's world, in a CAISO stakeholder process world, we are spending a lot of time, for those of us that are working on EDAM, on market design issues. Removing this limitation would enable the RIF to discuss very specific market design elements that are currently being debated in that stakeholder process. One example would be transmission provision or resource efficiency. We would also retain the open meeting process with all stakeholders still being allowed to participate and engage. And then we'd also enable the RIF to share directly with the governing body or with CAISO staff any consensus opinions that they are able to develop that are part of an ongoing CAISO stakeholder process. We would also want to develop a transparent process for establishing consensus positions and obviously define what constitutes a consensus position. And that would really be up to the RIF to develop those guidelines. They have flexibility as a part of their charter to do so. But that's how we're envisioning the RIF going forward. We want to formalize it, enable it to submit comments when consensus positions are reached by that body. So let's go to the next slide. And then in terms of finding a more formal role for consumer-owned utilities and power marketing agencies, what we decided to do with regards to this, this issue is to create essentially advisory positions on the body of state regulators for PMAs and for consumer-owned utilities. And what I'd like to do right now before describing that in detail is really turn it over to Commissioner Raper, who is involved in this discussion quite a bit, on how this recommendation might work in practice.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I will start by saying that at the beginning of the GRC process, it was made clear that the federal power marketing agencies and consumer-owned utilities or publicly owned utilities, POUs, PMAs, lots of acronyms, it was clear that they wanted a role in addition to just being a market participant, that there was an element of what they do and how they operate that that caused them to want something similar to the BOSSR structure in order to just be able to be a part of the dialogue from that perspective. And so the whole point of all of this, everything that Jennifer's talked about and modifications with the RIF that we're recommending, everything is to enhance the stakeholders' ability to participate. And so when you look at it from that perspective, I think initially there was a lot of pushback from the BOSSR. As a BOSSR member, I can say that, in including seats on the BOSSR to public power or PMAs. And I will say, in all honesty, part of that is because you have so many body of state regulator members already on the BOSSR that have quite divergent interests, that including the PMA and POUs on there as well would have further fractured our ability to come to consensus on issues. That being said, there is a point at which the interests of PMAs and POUs diverge from state regulators. However, there are also a lot of areas that they converge, and that dialogue, whether we agree or disagree on things or partially agree, is not as important as fostering the dialogue and enhancing the dialogue so that we can participate more fully with the board and the governing body. Collaboration and the shared dialogue is a good thing, and state regulators have some shared interests. So having ex officio members, which ultimately is the recommendation of the GRC, non-voting members of PMA, POUs on the BOSSR so that those entities can choose their individual to sit regularly in the BOSSR meetings, which are all public anyway, because of what our requirements are for open meeting laws through our states. But to have regular members that the BOSSR has a relationship with, that the PMAs and POUs have a relationship with within the BOSSR, that dialogue will assist in the overall content of and our ability to absorb the proposals and initiatives that come out of the CAISO. So we have been engaged. We, the BOSSR, have been engaged informally. Some members, not all members of the BOSSR, have been engaged informally with the consumer-owned utilities and some of the PMA representatives, and there seems to be pretty broad support for this type of partnership within the body of state regulators. So
Ultimately, I'm one of many, and we will have that discussion on a call soon within the BOSSR. But I certainly advocate for it. I think it's a good idea. I think that there's perspective to be gained on both sides that will be helpful to everyone and all of the underlying dockets and initiatives. And so the Governance Review Committee's recommendation in this regard is that several, I think it's nonspecific in number, that several ex officio liaison positions for PMAs and consumer-owned utilities be named to participate within the BOSSR activity. And Jennifer, that's all I have. If there's anything that you want to add.
Yeah, I think you did a really nice job, Commissioner Raper. Thank you. I don't have anything to add to this particular section on this ex officio role that's being created for consumer-owned utilities and PMAs on the BOSSR. What I do want to make clear is that in regard to the changes that the GRC is proposing to make to the Regional Issues Forum, the GRC does have two really specific asks of stakeholders when they consider submitting comments on a straw proposal. And number one is we want to seek additional input on whether any other aspects of the RIF process should be modified to better enhance stakeholder engagement. So in other words, have we offered enough sort of guideposts here to really formalize the role of the RIF and increase that stakeholder engagement, or do you have other suggestions that the GRC should consider in the next iteration? And then second, whether any changes should be made to the existing sector classifications that are used in the RIF. An example of this is we still have a sector on the RIF that's known as the Neighboring Balancing Authority sector, but as I'm sure many of you can relate, as more and more entities have joined the EIM, that sector is becoming increasingly small. And so is there a way to recharacterize some of these sector definitions so that we have a little bit more balance in terms of our representation on the RIF? And if you're curious about how other stakeholder sectors are organized, the EIM nominating committee has sort of a slightly different way of defining sectors that might be a good starting point for making changes to the RIF stakeholder sector classification. So with that, those are the only two additional things I wanted to add, and I'd love to open it up for questions if there are any.
Once again, if you do wish to ask a question, please hit pound 2 on your telephone keypad. Okay, I currently have no questions in queue.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for that nice overview. And we're going to transition to issue 4. Issue 4 is called Other Potential Areas, and there's actually kind of 3 major categories in that area. So we've got 3 different presenters for each one of them. We're going to start with Mary Winkie, and she's going to talk a little bit about the role in the roadmap process. So, Mary.
Thanks, Therese. We could just turn to the next slide. Thank you. So one of the items in this other bucket is a consideration regarding proposed changes to the roadmap process. And the question put forth in the scoping document was really about whether or not that process should be modified to require a formal vote of approval from the governing body or the board or both. And the GRC really took a deep dive into the roadmap process. I think that before being a member on the GRC, I was less familiar with the entire process, kind of soup to nuts. So we really spent a lot of time digging into the current process and thinking about potential enhancements to that process, even beyond incorporating some type of formal approval. But ultimately where we landed was to recommend that the current process be continued in terms of the level of formality that is currently in that process. We think that the current process works well. There's multiple opportunities for stakeholders to have input, and that introducing a formal approval requirement would have a potential negative impact on that process and the flexibility and efficiency and productivity of that process. I think in particular, we considered, the almost inevitable changes that get made kind of throughout the process, and if a change was made, having to go back to the bodies for additional formal approval, even beyond kind of an annual formal approval. So we just felt like the benefits of that formal approval were really outweighed by keeping the process flexible and efficient and in the hands of CAISO management. That said, we also did encourage some consideration by CAISO management to do more explaining on reasoning behind the decision and have a lot of as much transparency as possible regarding the relative priority of possible initiatives. There's a host of initiatives in the catalog, and difficult decisions are made through the process as far as what to prioritize. And so we just encourage that that information and that explanation in a greater level of detail in that process, but without going as far as requiring or recommending a formal approval by one of the governing bodies. That's all I have on that topic. I believe I am turning it now over to Doug Howe. Unless, Therese, for this one, do we want to take comments after each of the subtopics or wait until the end of issue 4?
Yeah, let's go ahead and wait until the end of issue 4. So we'll have Doug Howe talk about the role of the governing body with the Department of Market Monitoring, Market Surveillance Committee, outside market expert.
Okay, great. I'll turn it over to Doug then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. And if you would change the slide. In the original scoping paper, stakeholders were asked for their views on whether the governing body should have a role in the oversight of the Department of Market Monitoring, the Market Surveillance Committee, or both. And I'm just going to refer to those by their common acronym, the DMM and the MSC. So to be clear, the DMM is an internal unit of the CAISO, but reports directly to the Board of Governors. Its objective is to evaluate existing or proposed rules, regularly report on market performance, and report potential market rule violations. The MSC, on the other hand, is a committee of 3 outside market experts that provides input and opinions on market design proposals, but it is not a market monitor. Comments that we received ran the spectrum from maintaining the status quo to concern that the DMM and the MSC were too California-focused and might miss or otherwise not focus on market issues outside of California. Others pointed out that the governing body should have a role in the oversight of the DMM and the MSC. There were also comments that EDAM, should it go forward, would be sufficiently different from the existing day-ahead market in California that it would need its own outside market expert. So with these comments in mind, the GRC has proposed and seeks comment on the following. First, with respect to the DMM, the GRC has been reassured that DMM does actively monitor the EIM and reports on this regularly to the governing body. Nevertheless, going hand in hand with the recommendation of joint authority, the GRC recommends that a governing body member be invited to attend all of the executive sessions of the DMM Oversight Committee as a way to assure EIM entities and the governing body itself that the DMM continues its active monitoring of the EIM and, if it goes forward, the EDAM. With respect to the MSC, the GRC is proposing that the governing body have joint authority with the Board of Governors to appoint members to the MSC in order, again, to assure EIM participants that the governing body has an equal voice in the direction given to the MSC. And I think, yes, we need to change the slide one more time. Lastly, if the EDAM moves forward, the GRC makes an additional recommendation that the governing body be given access to an outside market expert of their choosing, because the final design of the EDAM is likely to be complex and sufficiently different from the existing CAISO day-ahead market that a fresh set of expert eyes is likely to be necessary. But we also propose that the purpose and benefits of an outside market expert be reevaluated within 5 years from its creation. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Therese.
Great, thanks, Doug. And we'll transition now to Rebecca Wagner that is going to talk about funding for the body of state regulators.
Thanks, Therese. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your time and hopeful attention on a Friday afternoon. As part of our initial straw proposal, we sought feedback on how and what funding for the body of state regulators would look like. And just as a step back, as a way of background, the BOSSR determined that they really needed additional resources to better engage in the ISO policy initiatives. I think often commissioners and commission staffs are hamstrung, both in terms of workload and lacking personnel. So to be engaging in a meaningful way, the BOSSR sought some sort of mechanism to better participate. In doing so, they entered into a memorandum of understanding with the Western State Energy Board, or WEEB, and that if BOSSR could find a funding source, WEEB would provide the technical assistance. So turning back to the scoping paper, knowing that background, we asked a series of questions about what BOSSR funding would look like, and like what would be the mechanism or the source for it, how would that look like, and some of the parameters around those funding, or that funding. Commenters generally agreed that there is value in BOSSR having additional expertise, always a good answer for the regulated entities to support their regulators. But one area that became a little trickier was just a matter of equity, is that if it was a CAISO tariff charge, there would potentially be entities paying into it that do not have PUC or PSC regulation. So, which brings us to the conundrum that we're in. We think that the GRC thinks that there's value in funding the BOSSR, but we don't make a recommendation just yet. We want to seek further input on other potential funding mechanisms. But I would note right now that the EIM entities are working out potentially an idea that the utilities that are subject to the jurisdiction of state commissions are coming up with an alternative funding source. So it could be just directly through each individual jurisdiction in each state. There's more to come on that, but at this point we have no recommendation, but we certainly seek additional ideas. I don't think we've come through an exhaustive list, but open to other mechanisms of funding. I have a bunch of jokes I could probably come up with about funding sources, but I'll leave that alone for now. But that wraps up our segment on the BOSSR funding and issue 4. Back to you, Therese.
Thanks, Rebecca. The jokes might be good on a Friday afternoon, but we'll turn now and see if anybody has any questions or comments on any one of those areas. So again, part of what we're hoping to do with this conversation is if you need clarification or some additional information or even just some initial reactions, we would welcome that.
If you do have any questions and or comments, please hit #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. Once again, it is #2, also known as #2. to enter the question queue. Okay, let's give them a few more seconds just in case anybody gets on the queue.
Thank you.
Once again, it is #2.
Okay, we're going to transition to issue 6. Suzanne Cooper is going to talk about other potential topic areas for consideration. I think I skipped one, didn't I? Is there issue 5? No. Yes, I did skip one. Issue 5. Suzanne's doing both issue 5 and issue 6. So the governing body mission statement and other topics for consideration. So Suzanne, will transition to you.
Hey, thank you, Therese, and good Friday afternoon to everybody. Issue 5 is around the governing body's mission statement. As we were evaluating comments and developing the guiding principles for the GRC's work that Therese spoke about at the beginning of this session, we also considered whether any modifications to the governing body's mission statement should be made, either for EIM now or for EDAM. And in doing that, we, as you can see on the slide, we didn't have any recommendations for adjustments to the mission at this point in time, given that it seems it's a pretty sound mission statement. It seems to still be quite applicable to the market and the governing body's work and role. However, we do recognize that as more details of the EDAM market design become known, there may be a need to update the governing body's mission statement. So we were kind of reserving full judgment on it until those details become more known. And we are asking in the draft straw proposal stakeholders if you all would comment on this topic. And we specifically identify a couple of questions in the straw proposal. The first one being whether the governing body mission should be updated to reflect the potential evolution of EDAM. And the second part is if you do believe it should be updated, at what point in time should EDAM-specific changes be considered, and should those be considered as part of the GRC's current process or through some other mechanism? So that's issue 5. Therese, do you want to do 5 and 6, or do you want, before asking for questions, or do you want to go ahead and ask for any questions or feedback now on issue 5?
You can go ahead and do issue 6 and then ask for questions.
Okay. Oh, I forgot about asking for slides to move. So you can, if you could please move 2 slides. So issue 6 is on other potential topics for consideration, and there are 2 areas where the GRC has made recommendations. One with regard to governance reevaluation, and the other with regard to timing of implementation of the GRC's recommendations. So in terms of our timeline, we plan to submit our draft final proposal to the governing body and the ISO board in Q1 of 2021. We recognize that this timing is ahead of EDAM market design details being solidified, and that some of those details might inform any EDAM-specific proposals around for governance. But thus far, we believe many of the changes that are being proposed for governance will most likely apply to both EIM and EDAM. So we don't believe there should be a delay in moving forward with getting our recommendations to the governing body and the CAISA board so that those that are applicable to either both markets or just to EIM can be implemented in a timely fashion. That said, our draft final proposal, once the draft final proposal is submitted, we are recommending that the GRC remain available to assess whether any EDAM-specific aspects would need adjusting once the final draft of the EDAM market design is complete. And lastly, we are also proposing that in terms of a reevaluation of governance, we're proposing that a stakeholder-led review of the governance structure occur no later than 5 years after implementation of any changes. So, for example, if there were changes that were implemented for the current EIM market, and perhaps there might be additional changes with EDAM if that all plays out, then the 5-year period would be upon sort of the implementation of the first set of changes. And that is it. We definitely encourage stakeholder feedback on these issues of timing, and I think Cal can now if there are any questions or feedback on issue 5 or issue 6.
Okay, once again, to ask a question and or comment, please hit #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the queue. It is #2, also known as #2, to enter the queue. Okay, we do have one caller in queue. Caller, your line is now unmuted. Caller, perhaps your cell phone device is on mute. Please unmute your device.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. Sorry about that. This is Lauren Tenney-Dennison from the Public Power Council. I had a quick clarification on the approach for finalizing the 2 different pieces, the EIM and the EDAM piece. First, I think taking that approach of trying to get the EIM changes in place as soon as practical, that makes a lot of sense. For the EDAM piece, then would the idea be to have a nearly finalized proposal and then maybe one more review or at least a stakeholder meeting once the market design is finished so that there could be some discussion about that whole EDAM package together? Just kind of wondering how that finalization of the EDAM governance would work.
Yeah, so what we've talked about are a couple of potential approaches, and we're certainly open to feedback from stakeholders and ideas from stakeholders in this regard. One could be that there's a step between before the EDAM design actually goes to the governing body and the board, where the GRC takes a look at, reviews the governance proposal, and sort of gives a thumbs up or no, it looks like some things need to be tweaked and there could be a process there. Another thought we had is that, the governing body and the board could request that the GRC do a review. They look at the actual EDAM market design, and if they perhaps would like another set of eyes from a governance perspective on it, they make that request.
Okay, thank you. And is that something that you'd be looking for stakeholder feedback on?
Yes, sure.
All right, and there are no more questions in queue.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, which talks about next steps. So here's kind of where we're at. It's August 7th. We're having this general session meeting. Tried to give you a high-level overview of the STAR proposal and some of the logic behind it. The way the document is structured is we did try to give you a high-level sense of the comments that we received and then the rationale that the GRC used to come up with the recommendation. Also posted in a separate document is a comment matrix, so you can see all the comments that we did receive and kind of where they're addressed. Often if a comment was received on a topic that we did address in the paper, it just references that section in the paper, but for those that maybe weren't addressed specifically, there are comments there. I'm glad you got to see a number of the Governance Review Committee members today in this presentation. It's just, like I said, it's a really terrific team to work with. If there are questions you have and you want to reach out to one of them, and any one of us, feel free to do that over the next month if you have clarifying questions, just to understand. We really look forward to your comments on August 28th. And like I mentioned, on September 15th, we do have a general session. And what we're looking for is the opportunity to discuss stakeholder comments. So if you have an interest in kind of talking about your comments, we would be happy to have you be a part of that. I do want to turn this over to Peter for a moment, Peter Calusi from the CAISO for a moment, because as you can see in big red letters there, there's a new review, or there's a new process for submitting comments as part of the CAISO stakeholder processes, and we're the first one that gets to use this. So Peter, do you want to talk to folks a little bit about what the new process looks like for submitting comments?
I sure will. Thanks, Therese, and thanks everyone for participating in the call today. So like Therese mentioned here, we are rolling out a new commenting tool for submitting comments. That will allow you to directly input those comments. It'll automatically post to our website and will increase the functionality and searchability of those comments as well as, like I said, posting them closer to real time. There is one additional step that we're going to need folks to do, and that's to go ahead and register. There is going to be some information about how to do that at the the EIM GRC initiative webpage, where you'll be able to find all the information as well as videos about how to register, how the commenting tool will work, etc. That'll all be posted up there for you. The commenting tool will open on Monday, August 10th. That'll go ahead and be the first time that we're going to put that out live for stakeholders. And as always, if you've got any questions or concerns, we do have the ISO Stakeholder Affairs website here. Please don't hesitate to shoot either that one or myself any questions or concerns that you have about the process. Thanks, Drew.
Great. Okay, we'll take one last opportunity for questions or comments.
Once again, if you do have a question and or comment, it is #2 to enter the question queue.
And if there are no other comments, thanks again for joining us today. Thanks for having an interest in the STAR proposal, and we look forward to your comments at the end of the month.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.